Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, Creating a Model Victims Compensation Policy. If you are just joining us, please introduce yourself in the chat box as we wait for others to join us today. So please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box with your name, what state you're calling in from. Also, if you want to drop in your title or organization as well. My name is Aswat Thomas. I'm the Vice President of the Alliance for Safety and Justice, also serve as the National Director of our flagship program, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. So we're pretty excited for today's webinars. You all will hear from crime survivors, advocates, and policy experts on how we can make crime victims compensation a program that benefits all. So we'll get started in a few minutes, but as we wait, please feel free to drop in yourself in the chat box and introduce yourself as well. Cool. Awesome. I'm going to give some shout outs to folks who are joining us today. Let's see who we got here. See, we have Mark is joining us. Let's see, we have Alexandra, see Lanisha, see Elizabeth Cronin from New York. It's awesome. Patricia Ward, see Michelle Crum in Florida. Daisha Darby in Ohio. Chris Stiles in Cincinnati. Awesome. This is going to be an awesome webinar today. A lot of advocates, a lot of survivors who are leading on these issues. Also see individuals who are here to learn as well. So thank you all so much for joining today's important conversation about victims compensation and how we can improve the program and all the great work that you all are doing to increase access and remove barriers as well. Once again, my name is Aswat Thomas. I'm the Vice President of the Alliance for Safety and Justice. And for today's webinar, everyone will be on mute except for our amazing panelists who you all see right now, who you all will hear from shortly as well around their work in their state in improving victims compensation. Today's webinar is hosted by the Alliance for Safety and Justice and Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice is a national network of 90,000 crime survivors that are joined together to share our stories, to heal together, and also to advocate for a justice system that prioritizes healing, prevention, and recovery over more spending on incarceration. Today, we are excited at the Alliance for Safety and Justice to release our new report titled Created a Model of Victim Compensation Policy. We're going to talk about best practices for victim compensation, and that includes, three simple things. It's about maximizing eligibility. It's about providing long-term support and also flexible support as well. When it comes to eligibility, there's no downside in maximizing the eligibility for compensation. So we need to examine all eligibility requirements. You all will hear from experts today who have been able to do that in several states. Also, when it comes to longevity, we all know that the long-term impacts that crime survivors face aren't resolved with one check or one counseling appointment or 1 month of relief from rent or covering lost wages. We need to provide victim services that recognize the long-term impacts of violence and provide accommodations to help people heal. When it comes to flexibility, we know that compensation is a reimbursement based model. That is not flexible. So we need to really help victims immediately. We need to find more holistic ways to help people heal. And that is at the center of what we do here at the Alliance for Safety and Justice. The Alliance for Safety and Justice, we've been able to work with Republican and Democratic lawmakers to improve and reform victim compensation systems across the country. And many of these reforms are often driven by the direct experiences of our members who have faced significant challenges accessing victim compensation. We have talked to and we've surveyed thousands of crime survivors and service providers about their experiences with the victim compensation. And that's how we've been able to come up with a lot of the policies that you all will hear from today. And like many of us in this work is personal to me. I was 26 years old when gun violence almost ended my life. You know, just after I graduated from college and was on my way to play professional basketball overseas, I was shot twice on my back during an attempted armed robbery while leaving my local neighborhood store. And those bullets ended my basketball career and it almost ended my life. But unfortunately, like so many victims on this call today, I was never made aware of the victims' compensation program. And far too many victims do not access compensation or face significant barriers to compensation as well. So that's why we're excited to have this conversation, because that must change. All crime victims should be entitled and access victim compensation. So we're excited to hear from some incredible advocates and policy experts that are working to change victim compensation policies across the country. We have Andy Gentile, who's the Senior State Policy Manager at the Alliance for Safety and Justice. We have Gabriel Garcia, who's the Advocacy Director at Youth Alive. We have Cristel Perez, who's the Bureau Chief for the Crime Victims Compensation Bureau in the Office of the Illinois Attorney General. And then we also have Katie Hunter-Lowry, who's the Crime Survivor Organizer and Policy Advocate at Louisiana's Crime Survivors for Reform. So now let's hear from you, Andy, to share a little bit more about the Victims Compensation Program, what some of the work that the Alliance for Safety and Justice has been doing across several states. Andy?
Thanks so much, Aswad, and really just super honored to be here with you and with this incredible panel and this amazing group of folks who are on the webinar talking about this. Really just is such an important topic for supporting survivors. Know that a lot of folks who are on this webinar already know the ins and outs of compensation programs well, maybe have applied for compensation yourself or helped others apply or work in or with compensation programs. But do want to start with just a little bit of background, because we know that there are also folks on this call who are wondering, what are we here to talk about? Maybe haven't heard a lot about compensation programs before. So every state has a victims compensation program, and these are set up to cover really critical survivor expenses like medical bills, funeral and burial costs, relocation, counseling, lost wages or loss of support in the wake of violence. And these compensation funds can be a real lifeline that allows survivors to focus on safety and healing. Without this kind of support, survivors often have to scramble to raise funds to cover critical expenses while dealing with trauma and grief, or often just not get that needed help at all, which just compounds the violence and the trauma. So these programs are funded largely by states, but with some matching funds from the federal government. And that amount of federal funding has actually recently gone up when Congress passed the VOCA Fix Act last year. So the federal government is taking on a larger share now, but still, largely these programs are funded through the state. And as Aswad shared, these programs have great promise and wonderful people who are trying to get these funds to survivors and working hard to do that, but too few survivors are getting funds from these programs. We hear from survivors around the country who either have just never heard of their state's compensation program, or who have been told they're ineligible or that they'll be denied if they apply. We know that only about 1 in 10 survivors of violence ever gets help from any victim services provider, and far fewer survivors ever even apply for compensation, let alone receive it. Even among survivors who go through the often fairly arduous application process, nationally, about 1 in 4 applications for compensation are denied outright. This can send a message to survivors that a survivor isn't worthy of support, can compound trauma, and also means that survivors aren't getting really urgent help that they're needing and that they are entitled to. Often there are subjective eligibility restrictions and unnecessary red tape that are built into law, and many that have the impact of putting survivors sort of on trial and denying survivors needed help. Survivors who jump through the hoops to apply are even if they make it to the end, are sometimes waiting months or even years for a decision, which is not helpful when the costs the program is supposed to cover are urgent, when it's about moving to somewhere safe or being able to bury a loved one with dignity. Particularly eligibility restrictions that are entangled with law enforcement and with the criminal legal system lock survivors out of compensation. Common restrictions also entrench racist perceptions of survivors as deserving or undeserving. And we know that survivors of color and other oppressed groups are denied compensation at much higher rates. Recent analyses of compensation denial data, for example, have found that states apply subjective exclusions that blame the victim for their own victimization, apply non-cooperation restrictions, and in states that have them, conviction-based restrictions to deny Black victims and families at hugely disproportionate rates. Even when survivors do get help, it's often not nearly enough to cover the actual costs, or just doesn't cover most expenses that survivors actually need, or a lot of those expenses. So over the last several years, driven by the calls of survivors who have not gotten needed help from these programs, the Alliance for Safety and Justice, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, and so many other great organizations and state partners who are, many of whom are on this panel and on this webinar today, have been building momentum to really remove some of these barriers to healing and support so more survivors can access these important programs. So I'm going to share just a few examples of policies we've worked on in a few states, and then really, again, just honored to be on this panel with such a tremendous group of people who are going to share about other campaigns that have been happening across the country. So I'm going to start in Ohio, where SB 36 passed last year in 2021. So before the passage of SB 36, Ohio had the second highest victims' compensation denial rate in the country. Due to some of the most restrictive and discriminatory laws on the books in the nation, among survivors who got to the point of going through the entire application process, nearly 6 in 10 survivors who tried to get help were getting turned away every year. That's 6 in 10 survivors who applied. So a survivor applying for compensation in Ohio who got through the entire application process was more likely than not to be denied. Ohio was one of only a handful of states that denied survivors based on a past conviction. Only 8 other states have these types of restrictions still on the books. Ohio also denied victims and their families if the victim allegedly had drugs in their system at the time of the victimization, which is incredibly traumatizing. Under this law, family members of loved ones killed in homicides were denied funds for a funeral if an autopsy report showed that the victim had used drugs, regardless of if it had anything to do with what had happened. So SB 36, survivors in the state worked with lawmakers and other partners in the state to pass SB 36 to reverse all of these policies that I just mentioned. The bill also changed the law to make sure that survivors of victims killed in homicide will never be denied based on allegations about a deceased victim's actions. And SB 36 made the application process more transparent and limited subjective denials based on allegations about an applicant's actions. So going to stay in the Midwest, Michigan's compensation program has had the lowest application rate in the country. So survivors in Michigan were not even bothering to apply for the program or not hearing about the program at all. And that has led to Michigan spending less per reported violent incident on compensation than any other state program. So extremely limited eligibility relative to other states, really restrictive rules, and an outdated application process that parts of which were written into law to be that way have driven a lot of these issues. So ASJ, CSSJ worked with survivors and organizations and legislators and the Crime Victim Services Commission to pass HB 4674 and 4675 earlier this year. And these bills will go into effect next August. They'll reduce paperwork hurdles, ensure more critical costs like relocation and transportation are covered, and that expenses are covered at the level of actual need or closer to that level, that survivors are eligible even if they don't go to law enforcement immediately after they're victimized, and that family and household members who are impacted by a violent act can get the support they need as well. Previously, also in Michigan, only people who were physically injured in a violent act were eligible, which was a pretty unique restriction. Not a lot of states restrict compensation in that way. Most other states cover victims of violence where there's an emotional impact, but no physical injury. For example, stalking survivors, survivors of armed robberies where there isn't an injury. So HB 4674 and 4675 ensure that Michigan survivors who are threatened with violence also have access to compensation for things like counseling, lost wages, relocation. And then in moving over to Texas for a moment, survivors in Texas campaigned to pass a bill, SB 957, that clarifies that no survivor should be denied compensation based on the way they interact with law enforcement at the scene or in the hospital. And this bill received bipartisan support, passed the legislature in the last session. So these are just, and thanks Aswad for bringing these up on the screen. Give everyone a minute to just take a look at that slide. These are just some of the policies that are highlighted in the report that we'll be releasing today. So really encourage folks to go take a look at that. And with that, going to pass it back to Aswad and our other panelists to share about some of the other efforts that are happening around the country.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andy. And also want to give a shout out. I see, several survivors here on today's call who's been helping to champion those victim compensation reforms in Texas, in Ohio, in Michigan as well. Our work is centered around survivors and the importance of them, talking with administrators, talking with legislators, testifying at hearings. And I see even in the chat box, a lot of individuals really identify with some of the barriers and challenges that we've lifted up already on today's call. So just want to appreciate everyone who's had experiences with compensation that may not have went well, but I think what we're hearing today is the possibilities that could happen when we all work together to remove those barriers as well. Gabriel, would love to bring you in here. Your organization, Youth Alive, is doing amazing work in California, are working directly with survivors who often also have experience with applying for compensation. I know Youth Alive also is working on several bills in California to address compensation. We'd love for you to share a little bit more about Youth Alive and some of the work that you all are doing in the state and the legislative work.
Thank you, Aswad. I appreciate that. So hello, everybody. My name is Gabriel Garcia. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director for Youth Alive. And we are a community-based organization in Oakland, California that focuses on serving victims of violent crime. So the way that we think about our work is in three different buckets when it comes to addressing violence. One is violence prevention. So we have a high school program where we teach students a curriculum around gun violence, and then those high school students teach that to middle school students. So we get to do this intergenerational leadership development as part of our prevention efforts. But what I'm really going to be talking about today is our intervention and healing program. So when it comes to intervention, we have a hospital-based violence intervention program. So for those that aren't familiar, this was an international model now, but it was actually created by Youth Alive here in Oakland. And essentially what we do is we go to the hospital bedside of folks who have been directly harmed by violence, whether that is a gunshot wound that they are healing from, a stab wound, or physical assault. Because we know, based off of our experience of doing this for decades, that in those critical moments where somebody is recovering from a gunshot wound or a stab wound, that is the most opportune time to intervene and provide the healing resources that people need in order to recover from the trauma of surviving a violent incident. Now, with our healing program, what I want to uplift is our Gaddafi Washington project. That it was created by the mother of Gaddafi Washington, who was shot and killed in Oakland in the 90s. And what we've learned is, based off her experience, her name is Marilyn Washington Harris. Marilyn's experience was, after she lost her son to gun violence, there wasn't anybody there to help her pick up the pieces and navigate through the aftermath of losing her only kid at the time. So what she did was created a program based off of what she knew she needed. And a big part of that is helping folks navigate through the victim compensation program. As has been mentioned multiple times today, a lot of folks who are absolutely eligible for these benefits, for these programs, do not know about them. And even if they do, the process of actually applying and navigating for them is a lot to take on when you're already just trying to make it through the day, when you're trying to survive in that aftermath where trauma has shut down your ability to understand something that is brand new. So in addition to the shock of that trauma, trying to navigate this program on your own is something we know is a huge challenge. So these two programs, Caught in the Crossfire, where we're able to get into the hospitals, and Gaddafi Washington Project, where we're able to work directly with folks who have lost a loved one to homicide, they have taught us a lot, and we get to hear directly from survivors, from our clients, around what this process is like. So for those clients who are fortunate enough to stick with us, navigate through the process of applying and get approved, I've heard directly from them how life-changing these programs and services can be. Unfortunately, because we do this work for almost every single family in Oakland who experiences a homicide, we're also intimately familiar for all the reasons that people get denied, whether that is a lack of cooperation with law enforcement, which there's hundreds of reasons for, or a determination by law enforcement that the person who passed away or who was harmed was involved in the circumstances leading up to their victimization. Both of which we want to see people getting the support, the healing resources that they need, but as is currently structured, are prevented from doing so based off of the victim compensation program as is. So what I want to highlight today is the way that we've really built off of those experiences and partnered with organizations like Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice and Californians for Safety and Justice to not only identify where those barriers are, but develop policy solutions based off of those experiences so that we can make sure that folks can get those healing resources. So what I want to talk about today is the first bill that we came together to partner on, which was Senate Bill 299. So even though we've been doing this direct service work for decades, we are new to the policy work. We are new to making sure that these voices and stories are really informing the way that Youth Alive can be a voice at the state level for victims and survivors of violent crime. And what we've noticed, especially with victims of police violence, but also the families of homicide victims, is that law enforcement for too long has been the sole determiner of who is a deserving victim. So whether that is requiring victims and survivors to cooperate with law enforcement, or not even recognizing victims of police violence as folks who require healing, we saw those as two opportune areas where we can not only remove the requirement that law enforcement is a determiner of who is a deserving victim, but expand accessibility and eligibility for these resources. So being able to address the fact that not every person who is going to be harmed is a perfect victim, but those folks still deserve the healing resources that they need, because when they don't get those resources, we know that not only perpetuates their own trauma, but makes it more likely that they might be a perpetrator of violence, or makes it more likely that folks in their family, folks in their community will experience harm because of that unresolved trauma. So this is not just about focusing on single individuals. This is about understanding that trauma that comes from being impacted by violence can impact a whole community. So yes, thank you for sharing the link about our programs. I just covered two today. So we are able to take in a lot of input from our clients and bring that into the policy work. But where I really want to focus on for my last bit is talking about SB 993. So with SB 299, we were able to be very targeted with the ways we were trying to reform the system. SB 993 goes even further. And I saw some questions in the chat around, how can we get beyond just a reimbursement system? Because CalVCB, as a payer of last resort, the Victim Compensation Board, as a payer of last resort, is really designed for those most marginalized members of our community, those who have nowhere else to turn, no life insurance, no health insurance, no ability to relocate on their own if they no longer feel safe in their homes. SB 993 takes that even further by creating a pilot program called the Flexible Assistance for Survivors Pilot Program, where community-based organizations like Youth Alive will actually be able to provide direct cash assistance, so that instead of a reimbursement model, we can help people out on the front end. And that is something that we're really proud to be a partner on and lend our voice on in the state of California. So I'll pause there, but happy to share more in the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Gabriel, you just lifted up just so many solutions, right, to help crime victims navigate trauma and to help people heal. So your last, a comment just related to the importance of, compensation. It doesn't have to be, just the roles and responsibility of the state administrator. You have programs like Youth Alive who have deep access to crime victims who are often the first responders in the community, who can play a key role in helping people, know about the compensation program, help people fill out the application, also serve as a liaison with the justice system as well. So just appreciate the great work that you're doing and Youth Alive is doing, Gabriel, in California. And it's a testament to just how important, how vital local community-based organizations are into addressing the needs of survivors and helping remove barriers to compensation. But before we go over to our next panelist, Andy, would love to, is there anything that you would like to share just about SB 299 or the other bill that Gabriel talked about as it relates to some exciting things that's also happening in California as it relates to compensation for people who are victims of police violence? Anything you want to expand about those two bills?
Just super appreciate, echo everything, Aswad, you just shared, and just appreciate, Gabriel, the partnership and the work on 299 and 993. And, I really, again, encourage folks to go to the report. The wonderful thing about SB 993 is that it really takes in so many of the recommendations that are in that report. It really is one of those bills that really seeks to say, okay, what are all of the things that we might do to make this program more accessible to survivors, to reduce discrimination, to remove those barriers? And so really excited about that bill. Really excited about SB 299 and removing, restrictions for survivors of police violence who are virtually unable to access compensation right now. So thank you for sharing about those, Gabriel, and also, just really appreciate the partnership and the work on those bills in California.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. Thank you, Andy. So now let's go over to the Midwest. Cristel Perez, the Office of the Illinois Attorney General has really made a strong commitment to improving the state's program. Can you share some insight into the efforts of your office and listening to survivors to help inform some new legislative changes to the compensation program that's part of the historical HB 3653 bill from last year?
Hi, yes, thank you so much for having me today. So our compensation program is made up of the criteria that you pretty much see throughout the state. We have to have a compensable crime, timely notification, cooperation, no contributory misconduct, and timely filing. But what we saw with that is that even though those are the statutory criteria that may be well-intentioned on the face, there were denials. As you heard echoed throughout, there were denials all throughout. There were numerous barriers to receiving that type of assistance. So the Attorney General had a push to change that, to make sure that we really serve those people. We too recognize that money doesn't solve everything. It doesn't solve all the problems. It doesn't give them everything they need, but it does help. And it helps specifically for the people who are coming to us, who should be coming to us, who need it. So we looked at some of those barriers. We talked to survivors, providers, community partners, stakeholders, and we saw that a lot of them weren't receiving it simply because they were being denied. And they were being denied because there was this idea that somehow they deserved maybe what happened to them, that they didn't deserve this assistance, that we didn't want to unjustly enrich them, that there was possibly some fraud on the part of the individual. So there were all these overlapping ideas that just kept filtering through the compensation program. So the first thing we had to do was recognize what the problems were. What was going on? What were the views? Why were people who were victims of sexual assault being treated differently than gun victim survivors? Why were they being given compensation to people that looked one way and others were being denied? And then there's this thing where you have to desire to make that change, because we also found that there were simply people who didn't recognize it, which a lot of people don't recognize these biases. Even now, some people are denying that they actually exist, denying that they're suggesting that this person is a criminal because of the way they look, that when they say they didn't know who the offender was, that they're lying. We've had an individual who was shot in the back who said she didn't know who the offender was, and it was written in the police report that she simply didn't cooperate. Well, we know that it wasn't lack of cooperation, it was simply lack of knowledge, but there was this assumption that she wasn't telling the truth. So assumption that they're criminals, assumption that they're not telling the truth, an assumption that somehow they deserve what's happening to them. And that's what we were moving to change. So then having a desire to make those changes is really, really important. So you can have individuals who recognize there's a problem all day long, but they don't really have a desire to change it because in their mind, it's not really that big of a problem, or maybe this is just the way that it should be. And then once you have a desire to do that, not just having that desire, but taking affirmative steps to actually change it. So, and that takes an even bigger push because it's hard. I mean, you're going against the grain, you're going against these cultural norms to do something that's different. So the AG and our staff, we really push through to like, what can we do to make sure that this actually looks different? So you can change the statute and the laws all day, but you have to change the people and the policies as well. And so what we've really done is change the policies along with the law so that we can ensure that people are receiving what they need. Our amended act took place, started January 1st of 2022, and we're already seeing remarkable changes. And I'll tell you about some of those changes, but I first want to start with how much has changed. Our denial rate has gone down so significantly. Our staff is being trained to approve cases when and if they can. So if you're going to deny a case, it'll be a narrow statutory denial, which we have very few of those now. Most of them are approved. And if there is a way, like if you're on the fence, whether you can approve or deny, then the push should be to approve. That's what we're looking for. We can see those changes in the numbers. Just from January of this year to the end of May, we awarded more in compensation than the entire years of 2020, 2019, and 2021. Each one of those years, just in those few months, we gave more. We had fewer denials, gave more compensation. And again, this is a push, a change in the policy and a change in the law. We have increased compensation caps. Our funeral and burial expenses went from $7,500 to now $10,000, recognizing that funerals cost. And again, while money can't fix everything, money is still needed. And it does take a burden off of you that you won't have to stress about if you can have that compensation. Our compensation cap right now is $27,000. However, it will change from $27,000 to $45,000 August 7th of 2022 for crimes occurring on or after. Our monthly calculation for loss of support used to be $1250. Now it's going to go up to $2,400 for loss of support and loss of earnings. Our timeline for filing goes from 2 years to 5 years. Our felony status probation, individuals who have that will not be barred. Previously, they were barred from having their cases proceeded upon. We would hold them in some type of vortex for long periods of time. They would not be able to seek compensation. We could not go forward, but now we can because that has been removed. Adult children that were included as a separate victim category, while they were minors, they could only receive counseling expenses. Now as adults, they can still receive full compensation, recognizing that that parent-child relationship, that need to relocate, that need for loss of earnings for what they're doing for their deceased relative or injured relative, that remains. And so now they're included. We've now included an additional category for household members. It is a new defined category within our statute where a household member is now someone who has a substantially similar relationship to that of a parent, spouse, or child, and they can receive full compensation as well. Under our act, our compensation goes to our victims, dependents of those victims, or anyone who paid on behalf of them. So by adding that household member, we include that and allow them that full type of compensation. They can seek relocation expenses, loss of earnings, anything that applies, they can apply for as well. Then another big change, which is one of our larger changes, is to our cooperation and notification requirements. Recognizing that tenuous relationship there is, that difficulty some people have with law enforcement. The example that I gave you for lack of cooperation when this individual simply did not know. Right now, in addition to the other requirements or the other criteria, as an exception, receiving medical treatment at a hospital will be classified as notification and cooperation if done within that time period. See, what we've recognized is that the documentation of a police report does allow us to find out about the crime, what happened, or when it happened, and obviously some of the injuries that were suffered. We can get much of that from medical paperwork as well. And so we are using that as well to be a notification and cooperation requirement to meet that requirement. Now, cooperation, we've even taken a little further to recognize that there are a lot of reasons why, even if they don't cooperate, they don't. And we can consider their age, cultural and linguistic barriers. The big one is a fear of retaliation, which we know is real. When an officer writes in the police report that you didn't cooperate when you simply didn't know, there's a lack of trust. And so we understand that we do want people to cooperate when they can with law enforcement, but we do also understand that that's not always realistic. It's not always a possibility. And therefore, we still want to give these individuals what they need as to the best of our ability by removing that requirement. So in addition to that, we've changed our contributory misconduct review. So that was a huge basis for denials previously. And contributory misconduct in the previous policy could be anything from there being drugs in your car that didn't necessarily belong to you, to someone assuming that you were on your way to a drug deal and that's why you got shot. Or you having a background that was somehow unfavorable in their view, and therefore you could be denied. So again, the requirement of contributory misconduct, obviously if you're the offender, remains. However, who we're viewing as the offender, how we are viewing your involvement has changed, and it's become much more victim-centered and trauma-informed, recognizing that you are not the offender just because of what you look like. You are not the offender just because someone thinks you're the offender, or how people that look like you or act like you have been viewed in the past. You can still be a victim in that situation and will be treated as such under our new policies and law. In addition to that, we have our history of gang affiliation. Again, we are not using that as contributory misconduct or any type of mark on the individual at all. You can have any type of history there is and still be a victim. Statements that someone is compared to some type of notorious criminal and therefore they, should they receive compensation or should their families receive compensation? If they've been injured and they're innocent in that offense, they absolutely should. And so our policies are viewing on a case-by-case basis, on a situation-by-situation basis, what has happened to that individual and what should they have. So surviving family members of homicide victims obviously will not be automatically barred under our new statute from receiving forms of compensation, funeral and burial expenses, relocation, and many others. So we also have an expanding list of documentation that we'll accept. There were times in the past where we would simply say you had to have these specific documents to substantiate your claim to receive compensation. If you don't have them, then no compensation for you. And again, our staff is being trained to look at the documentation that the claimant has, look for what they can give you and see what can be done with it. Our claim is to help and not hurt. And so if there's something that we can do to assist that claimant, is there something that we can offer to them? Any way that we can offer it within the confines of the law and our policy, that is our goal to do it. And so if that is your position and that is your perspective, you're in the right place. And again, that is what we are moving forward. Again, we're here to help and not hurt, and we're here to serve. And I think in the past, it was not viewed as a position of service and a position that is really treated to care and concern for the community as it should. But under this AG and this administration, that is our policy now, and that is our procedure, and the laws and the policies have moved forward to do that. Again, no GoFundMe accounts will not be used as a basis to reduce. And again, we're reviewing these on a case-by-case basis so that we can grant. We have seen tremendous improvement under the new policies and law. We have seen more people being helped, more people moving forward, more people achieving the type of wholeness that we know that we can help them achieve. We can push them in that direction. We can give them what they need. And we know that we're only going to have more of that to come as we continue to implement our policies. We in the chat, I have asked them to put some notes in the chat, our fact sheet that tells a little bit more about our law, as well as our application process. I do understand that in the past, people have been reluctant to apply or have been applied and been denied. It is a new day. And so I am thankful for that new day and thankful for this opportunity to share it with you.
Thank you so much, Christelle. Definitely just wow, just incredible work from the office and really committed to making these changes. And so 3 things that I just want to just lift up what you mentioned is that, for anyone working in compensation or advocating for these problems, the first thing we got to do is recognize what the problems are, right? And really do that analysis of why victims aren't accessing the program. Why are some victims treated differently? Once you recognize that a problem and do that assessment, you have to have that desire to make a change, whether it's in the administrator's office, right, or whether it's with lawmakers or community members, like having that desire to make a change and then taking those necessary steps to make those changes. And often that's the shift in the culture, that's the shift in the policies and statutes, but it's really about making that commitment, that desire to make long-lasting change. And just to hear from you, share, you can just already see the impact that you all have already, awarded more claims, in the middle of this year and the previous years. And now that people are getting help, you are moving those barriers. So just incredible work from the Attorney General's office, and we appreciate you all's partnership and leadership, and as well as many other states who've made several changes over the past few years. This is what equity looks like. This is what healing looks like, and thank you so much. Now we was on the West Coast, we went to the Midwest. Now let's go down south. Katie, a lot of people may not know what's happening in Louisiana, so we'd love to hear from you about about your work in the state, and also the legislature in Louisiana just unanimously passed HB 648, which removed barriers to compensation. Can you share a little bit more about the work happening in Louisiana and the impact that will have for survivors and communities across the state?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Katie Hunter Lowry. I am the crime survivor organizer and policy advocate for Louisiana Survivors for Reform. We're a coalition of survivors of violence and homicide victims' loved ones working on change in the legal system. And this bill is so important because our fund is desperately needed for victims in our state, but it has really been neglected by policymakers and the criminal legal system for many years. Louisiana has the 5th highest crime rate in the country. We've had the #1 highest homicide rate for 30 years. We've also had the highest incarceration rate in the world for 12 years. So what has currently been happening is not working to interrupt cycles of violence. Most survivors and victims' loved ones don't even know about the fund. So we have a lot of work to do, but we were so overjoyed with the passage of HB 648. And this bill raises expense caps from $10,000 to $15,000 for applicants. It also raises the emergency award from $500 to $1,000. We added relocation as an eligible expense. And this bill also adds reporting options and extends those reporting timelines so that survivors are no longer required to report to law enforcement to receive funds, which is a part of this bill that we're really proud of. We weren't able to get the bill to go as far as we wanted in removing the language around when victims are said to contribute to the crime, but we did add language in that the board must now look at the totality of circumstances. So that wedges the door open a little bit wider to break that barrier. And so this was an issue that our coalition took up because it was identified by our members and by advocates as a huge gap in services. And we've been building on the work that advocates have done in recent years to address the extreme funding shortages and the way that the fund previously was not open to anyone who had a past criminal conviction. And so we couldn't have done it without those advocates. And I also really want to shout out to the Alliance for Safety and Justice and Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, Aswad and Andy. We couldn't have done this without the research and support of y'all. So thank you so much for your help. Part of our strategy was to specifically seek out a Republican legislator. Louisiana's legislature is extremely conservative, and having Representative Stephanie Hilferty offer this bill made a huge difference. She's championed survivor issues in the past, but has also carried bills for the incredibly powerful Louisiana District's Attorney Association. So she was a trusted voice in that space, and it made a tremendous difference in getting this bill passed. We also worked to attend the Crime Victims Reparations Fund board meetings before the legislation was even brought up in the legislature to present our ideas and our goals and hear from board members what they did and did not want to see change. And there was some agreement there that, the board was really enthusiastic about raising the emergency award to $1,000. But to be honest, there was also a lot of pushback, and they did not necessarily want to see some of the things change, but we kept the line of communication open. And we did work with the Louisiana Commission on Law Enforcement, which is where our fund is housed, to come to agreements on what we could both live with the bill. We were so fortunate to work closely with the chair of the board, Amanda Tonkovich. She is a domestic violence advocate and, was really able to clearly see the ways that the fund was not reaching everyone that it needed to reach. So her testimony added so much validity to our process, as did the powerful testimony from survivors and victim survivors who made the trip up to the legislature to testify. It's really, really a hard thing to do, to share one's story in front of these committees. And everyone was so brave. We had survivors and victim survivors from different parts of the state speak. They spoke about a range of experiences, from having astronomical medical bills following a sexual assault, to how difficult the application process was when they were in the grief of losing their loved one, to how some survivors spoke about how they didn't even apply because they would have been denied because of the ways crime victims, especially Black survivors and people of color, are criminalized in Louisiana. So that combination of testimony and outreach from folks who are directly impacted and people working in the system really made a great case for our bill. We had no opposition to the legislation, and we passed all of our committee and floor votes unanimously at each step, which I cannot say enough how in Louisiana that is a rarity, and we're really, really proud of that. So our coalition is now working to raise awareness statewide about these changes to the law so that more folks apply and reach out for financial assistance. We'll definitely be returning to the legislature to keep improving the fund and hope to keep pushing our state forward.
Thank you so much, Katie. And once again, extraordinary work happening across the country. And what I heard from you, Katie, was just a lot of collaboration and partnerships, right? From Republican legislators who wanted to champion these issues, crime survivors' voices, being heard, or with survivors taking that long trip up to the state capitol and sharing, what their experiences were and the impact and why this bill was important to them, and also, collaboration with the board, having the board chair provide testimony. So it's just a testament to the things that can happen, if we all work in collaboration and work in partnership together to address these issues. So even though we weren't able to get, you all were able to get everything this year, it just opened up that door to have those small wins, which often are large wins for us. So I'm excited just to see the work that you all will continue to do in Louisiana, and also, as we heard, in Ohio and Michigan and Texas and California and Illinois, and also other states who are championing these issues. And also at the federal level, there's a lot of advocacy and work happening as well. So I see the questions are coming in, so wanted to turn it over to our Q&A. If you have any questions, please feel free to write those in the chat box or use the Q&A feature. So several questions already started to come in, so I'll just open this up to all of our any of our panelists to jump in. So the first question is, when compensation funds often take so long to get to survivors and are usually reimbursement based, what else can we do in addition to improving these programs to get funds into the hands of survivors more quickly with less red tape? Let's start with you, Andy, and then we'll go to you, Gabe.
Thanks so much for that question. It's a really good one. And I think, Gabriel, I spoke to this earlier, but, the state victims compensation programs are just one tool that we have, right? And we've just heard about, there are barriers in those programs and their state systems. So they're, always going to, have some distance from survivors in community that are most harmed and least supported. And so, even survivors who may qualify, are going to have to navigate paperwork and restrictions that limit the kind of resources they're eligible for. In California, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice in 2021 launched the We Are Survivors campaign, which was a pilot to provide aid organizations with small grants to distribute cash assistance to survivors. And we, really saw lives changed by these funds. So, folks were able to, who were fleeing for their safety, were able to get secure housing. Folks were able to get funds to recover from their injuries or return to work. So, in addition to improving these compensation programs, making sure that these funds get to survivors as quickly as possible, that there are, you know, as little paperwork barriers and eligibility restrictions as we possibly can. States should also be establishing programs that allow, you know, that provide funds to community-based organizations, you know, that can in turn distribute funds and immediate cash assistance to survivors, perhaps for things that the state can't cover or doesn't cover, or for those expenses that can't wait for an application to be processed. You know, Gabriel mentioned this, but SB 993 in California, which is moving through the legislature right now, includes a proposed pilot program that would do exactly this. And a handful of other states and localities and tons of great organizations have been doing this for a long time, and seeing the impact it has to be able to say, hey, you need, you know, funds to, you know, get groceries tonight. You need funds to, you know, get gas in your car, and we can get that money to you right now. You need funds to bury your loved one, and you can't wait for a compensation application. We can get those funds to you right now. So really establishing those kinds of flexible and direct cash assistance programs in addition to compensation are important. And then just a plug for, you know, and Katie mentioned this, that, you know, Louisiana just did this, but improving those emergency award processes that are part of the compensation program, so that one, that survivors know that they exist if there are emergency award processes in the state, two, that they cover, you know, a larger share of the cost, if not all of the costs that folks need up front, and three, that they truly are emergencies, so that they get to survivors within 24 hours, 48 hours, that survivors aren't waiting a month to see, you know, things that we're calling emergency funds.
Yeah, I think Andy covered this in depth. The only thing that I would add is, in addition to making sure that we can get this flexible cash assistance from the state and have this be an intentional part of how they see themselves, states, governments see themselves supporting survivors, advocating for this at the local level too. So an example that we've been able to do in Oakland with the city government is increase relocation funds and make sure that Youth Alive can support more families who, again, whether they were victimized in their homes or are worried that the person who did the harm knows where they live, no longer feel safe in their homes. So getting funds for relocation has been a priority for us, and happy to report that the city just approved additional tens of thousands of dollars to make sure that we can relocate more survivors and victims of violent crime here in Oakland. So really looking at city governments, especially in places where we do have really heavy impacts of gun violence, of violence generally in our localities, making sure that the cities can see themselves as part of the solution as well. And saw a question in the chat around Alameda residents. It is for Oakland residents largely, and sometimes it is moving people out of Oakland that we're using these funds for.
Awesome. Thank you, Gabriel. So the next question, I think this is a question for Christelle. How do we make sure survivors know about these policies as part of the implementation? So what is the office doing as far as education, outreach, information means? We'd love to hear any insights and strategies and tips on how to make these survivors know after the bill has passed.
Yes, so we are getting out there, first of all. So each month we have a webinar at the beginning of each month, which is open to everyone. It is a part of our event, so we're letting individuals know. I can't even tell you how many of the seminars that I have done with the various advocates that all over the state. We do outreach that way with the police departments as well. We're reaching out to them. So we're using our staff, our outreach, myself, and we're just letting people know. So word of mouth, one person at a time, but we are letting them know. And the word is getting out. Our numbers of applicants is actually increasing. So I know that the word is getting out.
That's awesome. That's great. And I hear just from our members in Illinois, just raving reviews from those monthly town halls, those monthly informational sessions about the victims' compensation. So thank you all so much for pulling those together as well. So our next question I saw, let's see, it was a question from Bertha Purnell, who's also in Illinois. A question for you, Christelle. In Illinois, have you all considered having healing services such as meditation, Zumba, et cetera, along with mental health services to be covered under compensation?
So just for the way we handle our mental health services is Within the statute, it's a specific type of provider. So if the provider was willing to either offer that or they recommended that, it could still be potentially included under the umbrella. We don't have specific types of service that we exclude. So it just depends on the provider and what services or treatment that they recommend.
Awesome, thank you so much. The next question is, let's see. So how do we make sure compensation programs have the funding they need to expand? I would like to open that up for any of our panelists. How do we make sure compensation programs have the funding they need to expand?
So one unique thing that has happened here in Louisiana for our fund is that a portion of unclaimed gambling prizes is used specifically for the Crime Victims Fund for sexual assault survivors to cover forensic medical exams. So that's a dedicated amount of funding that goes directly to crime victims compensation. We also passed in 2017 a large slate of criminal justice reform bills that were aimed at decarceration and reducing our prison population to spend money on other things. So the money that has been used from the Justice Reinvestment Act, the JRI savings, has gone to the fund to deal with the backlog. So we're on a similar system to many other states where we rely heavily on VOCA funds, and in the past really relied heavily on fines and fees, which are much less now for the state. But those JRI funds are crucial, and we've been working really hard to tie support for criminal justice reform to the way that that money saved can directly impact victims.
Andy?
It's just great to hear about the different mechanisms that Louisiana is using and the creativity to really move away from a model that we know so many states are using, and we also know doesn't work for anybody. So many states are hinging their funding for survivors on fines and fees levied on people in the criminal justice system, largely low-income folks who cannot afford to pay these fines and fees, and who are harmed by trapped in cycles of debt. By these fines and fees, and then survivors in turn are harmed because they don't have stable funding sources. When programs consider doing, the things that we've talked about today to expand, often there are barriers because those funds are unstable, because that source of funding is not a reliable one. And we know at least 8 states are using almost entirely general funds to fund their compensation program. So we know that's possible. And Katie also just lifting up sort of the need to, move funds out of the prison system and to survivors. So in California, for example, the state is spending 80 times more on its prison system than on services to victims overall, not just the compensation program. And so we know the funds exist, that states have the funds, and getting creative about making sure that those funds are prioritized in the right ways, that survivors are getting the funding that they need, that the state considers the funding survivor needs and compensation programs a priority in budget making processes, and also thinks about the ways that the systems that we have right now aren't working for anybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andy. So we got about 2 minutes. Thank you all for, I know we weren't able to get to all the questions, but right in the chat box, we'll make sure our panelists respond back to those questions via emails. So there was just a lot of great insights into how to improve the compensation program. And I think we all have a role to play in this process. If you are an advocate, you heard about legislation in California, you heard about Andy talked about some of the work bills that were passed in places like Ohio and Texas, and heard from Christelle, Illinois. There's a lot of work that's happened that you all can support in those states, helping increase access to services. Also, if you work in a state, as Gabriel mentioned, a lot of work happens at the local level as well. So a lot of things that we can really encourage more trauma-informed training, more communication between compensation programs and staff is vital to making these changes. And also you can do things as you work with policymakers or administrators, encourage, annual review of policies, of practices, of the data on who's accessing compensation or not, and how you all can work together in that state to address these issues. One question in the chat was like, how can we be helpful? I think all of our panelists are open to providing support, guidance on some of the policies that they've worked with in our staff at the Alliance for Safety and Justice. We want to offer that support to you all as advocates, as survivors, or as key decision makers or legislators working on these policies. So we want to be a resource, and that's why we wanted to release this awesome report today to serve as some guidelines to help you all as you all are thinking about compensation and removing those barriers and healing after trauma. Is this possible? It's possible if we all work together in advocating for policies that really ensure that all crime victims get access to service, to ensure that all crime victims, especially crime victims in those communities most harmed by violence, those are the same communities least supported by the justice system, are least supported by traditional victim service, are least supported by victim compensation programs. So we can really, change this narrative about who crime victims are and what they want. And it starts by coming together and change policy. So thank you so much to our amazing panelists, Andy, Katie, Gabriel, Christelle. Today's webinar is recorded. We will share out the webinar recording. Also, we'll send out the email with the link to this report. So thank you all so much for engaging in today's webinar on how we can create model victims compensation policy guidelines, which is a blueprint for you all to work on improving compensation programs across the country. Once again, thank you all so much. We appreciate you all. Be well, be safe, and we'll talk to you all later. Thank you so much for joining us today.